received her bachelor's from Marquette. She has a master's in education from Loyola. Before coming to the Clinton School, she was with the AmeriCorps program and taught the 4th grade in the Chicago school system. Would you please, she's now working, by the way, as her group project with the Clinton School in Phillips County, working with the Arkansas Department of Human Services on children's health issues. Would you please welcome Erin Jones?
Hi, good afternoon. Today, it is my honor and privilege to introduce to you the Assistant Managing Editor and Chief Political Correspondent of Time Magazine, Michael Duffy. Originally from Columbus, Ohio, Mr. Duffy has spent the last 22 years in Washington, covering the top stories of the Pentagon and the White House. He spent 6 years covering both the Bush and Clinton administration, and in 1995 won the Gerald R. Ford Award for distinguished reporting on the presidency. Reporting on over 13 different cover stories for Time magazine throughout 1996, 1997 allowed him to concentrate almost full-time on campaign finance scandals, for which he was awarded the Goldsmith Award for investigative reporting in '98. Currently, Mr. Duffy oversees 20 correspondents, which is the news magazine's largest news gathering operation. During his years as chief political correspondent, Mr. Duffy has also co-authored Marching in Place, the status quo presidency of George Bush, with Time's Dan Goodgame. Most recently, Mr. Duffy has written a second novel along with Time's Nancy Gibbs entitled The Preacher and the Presidents, which highlights the relationships various presidents have had with evangelist Billy Graham. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Duffy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be here. It's not my first time to the old train station. I began coming to Little Rock in 1992 during the Clinton campaign. Everyone's telling to lean in, so I'm leaning in. I began coming to Little Rock in 1992 during the Clinton campaign, and 2 years ago, Skip let me know, with some notice actually, almost 24 hours, that they were going to have a little birthday party here for the library after 1 year. So I came down for that. It was mostly a barbecue and music thing. But like all great Clinton events, if you were willing to stay up late enough, you were rewarded at the end of the night with just an incredible speech by the former president. So it was a great time. This is the first time I've actually been officially invited to Little Rock, and I want to say, it's great when you get invited. Everyone has been really nice. I'm holding out for invitations now, and next time I come, it's really wonderful. I think the timing is interesting because we're at the beginning of a political campaign across the nation. It may not seem like the beginning to you, but it seems like the beginning to me. I'm just refusing to admit that it's started yet. And if it's any consequence, at Time Magazine, we're only now kind of getting organized about how we're going to cover it. But before I talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about faith and politics, which is, of course, the subject of the book that Nancy Gibbs and I at Time just finished about Billy Graham. And I want to start by talking about it generally. Like many of you, I'm inclined to listen with some skepticism when politicians discuss their faith. They are, of course, welcome to say whatever they want, but I'm always reminded of the story that my friend Jim Wallace, the liberal evangelist, tells about two senators having an argument in the Senate dining room. The Democrat was complaining about how Republicans paint all Democrats as a bunch of godless, sneering, secular elites. "Oh yeah," the Republican said, reaching into his pocket, "I bet you $20 you can't even say the Lord's Prayer." "I can too," said the Democrat. "Now I lay me down to sleep." "Oh hell," says the Republican, "I didn't think you could do it." And hands over the 20. This is more or less the same position most political reporters are in when it comes to faith and politics. We don't really know the Lord's Prayer from "Now I lay me down to sleep" either. And for that reason and for a lot of other reasons, in 2000, after the election, Nancy Gibbs and I looked at each other and said, we don't really understand faith and politics very well for people who've been covering politics for a long time. Why don't we figure it out? And so we were looking for a way to write about it, essentially. We knew that Time would have some appetite for it, but not a lot. So we thought, let's think about a book idea. And someone had said to us early on in that year, you guys ought to do a book about Billy Graham. And we had thought, it's too big. That's too big a character. He's one of the big figures of the 20th century. We're not that interested in Billy Graham. But then we kind of hit on the idea of writing a book about Graham and the presidents, because we knew kind of anecdotally that he'd known a bunch of them. We'd heard Clinton talk about them. Everyone knew the Nixon stories. Clearly, he'd had an impact on George W. Bush. And we thought to ourselves, if we could maybe get Graham to talk about the presidents and get the presidents to talk about Graham, we'd have a good tale. And we did get him. And we think we do have a good tale. There were a bunch of things we wanted to find out. How did, one man, one person, not a scientist, not a doctor, not a teacher, not a lawyer, not a politician, get to know 11 presidents? 11 is a lot. That's more than 1/4. Unless, of course, you count Mrs. Clinton, which would be 12. But I don't want to write the end of the story yet. We wanted to understand, after 2004, the rise of evangelical vote and power in the country. And I think we wanted to understand, once we got into the story, what presidents pray for. You can cover politics in the White House for a long time and actually never think about that question if you're like me. And yet it became the central question when we began to look at Graham and his relationships with the presidents. Well, a central question. So what did we find? First, I want to say a couple of things about faith and politics in general. Obviously, many people were startled 4 years ago. No, it was 8 years ago almost, when George W. Bush said his most important his political philosopher was Jesus Christ. But Jimmy Carter had said something very similar to that in 1976, and Ronald Reagan had said something very similar to that in 1968. So we wanted to find out, essentially, what bound people as different as Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson and Bill Clinton and Gerald Ford to Billy Graham, and vice versa. A couple of things we discovered. 3 things made Graham, I think, indispensable to the presidents. First of all, he was discreet. He learned to keep his mouth shut. He fought very hard to get in to see Harry Truman in 1952. He asked Truman if he read the Bible. Truman said, well, I try to follow the golden rule. And Graham said, at the age of 32, that's not good enough, Mr. President. And he said, we have to have prayer. He said, would you like to pray? Truman said, I don't see how it could hurt. And so they got down on their knees in the Oval Office. And it would have been fine, except that Graham went outside on the north lawn of the White House and proceeded to reenact the whole thing for reporters. And when that picture was on the front page of the papers the next day, Truman was not happy. I mean, not happy. Truman did not speak to him again until 1969. That's what we call a grudge. After that, Graham learned to be more discreet, but he didn't have to work very hard to get in to see presidents after that. By the early 1950s, he's a huge rock star. He's very famous. Eisenhower seeks him out and asks him, I've never really been to church. I've never liked going to church. What church should I go to? And Graham thundered, you shall be a Presbyterian. And Eisenhower became a Presbyterian. In fact, went to the church that Graham told him to go to in Washington and took the catechism courses that Graham laid out for him. And the two men proceeded in the 50s to spend a lot of time cranking a fair amount of faith and spirituality, Christian theology, into Eisenhower's speeches. In fact, Eisenhower invited Graham to Denver for the 1952 convention to help him write speeches, and Graham went. Until 2 weeks later, he thought, maybe this isn't such a good idea. There's a very famous story, I'm sure you know. This is the 50th anniversary this week of the Little Rock intervention by federal troops. 2 days before Eisenhower ordered the troops in 57, he calls Graham in New York, who just finished a 13-week crusade preaching to millions. It was the breakout crusade for Graham, and says, should I do this? And Graham says, yes, you have to do it. You must. You can't. They had had a long correspondence in 1956 and 57. Their longest correspondence of any president was between Graham and Eisenhower. figuring out what Graham could do to help in the South, going around preaching, basically putting his crusade agenda aside and going throughout the South and preaching integration. Graham had been very good on integration in the 50s. He was always preached integrated crusades, wouldn't go to cities where they wouldn't allow it. And Eisenhower reached out to him repeatedly for advice. The relationship continues all the way through. So he's discreet. He works hard at staying close to the presidents. And I think the other thing is that and this is something Hillary Clinton told us when we interviewed her, is that by 1960, Graham knew better than the presidents what it was like to be famous. He knew what it was like to have no private life. So when the first families came into office and they had problems or they had things they wanted to discuss, it made sense. Graham was obviously working hard to stay in contact. But she told us, he knew what a drag it could be to lose your privacy. And sort of he knew what celebrity was good for and what it wasn't good for. And in some ways, because he was one of the few people in America who was as famous, if not more famous than the presidents, they related to each other more quickly. It's just an interesting dynamic that I hadn't thought of until actually Mrs. Clinton teed it up. Looking at the 11 presidents, he knew 3 come to mind to whom he was closest. He was closest pastorally to Lyndon Johnson, there's no question. Johnson was in agony about Vietnam. He was constantly inviting Graham over to the White House when he was in town, asking him to come up to his bedroom and pray on his knees by his bed. Johnson was so terrified about his own physical mortality that he would often ask Graham to travel with him, be on the plane with him, Air Force One, because he figured, well, God's not going to take the plane down if Billy Graham's on board. He might want me, but he's not going to take Billy, which was pretty good betting. That's a sharp move. And Graham always went. Sometimes he says, Graham told us when we talked to him, he goes, I'd fly up to Washington just so I could fly back to, Atlantic City or Columbus or someplace very close. He said, but I would do it, and then I would come back home, and we'd spend the night together, and they'd spend all night praying. It's very interesting. Johnson was very concerned about Vietnam and very concerned about what it was doing to his legacy. He would have Graham down to the ranch, and he would talk for a long time about all kinds of worries. He asked Graham to pray, to lead at his funeral, and told him specifically and precisely what to say. He said, do not talk about me. Preach the gospel. Don't use my funeral as a chance to talk about my legacy. Just preach the pure gospel. But at the end, say something nice about me. It wasn't entirely a pastoral relationship. By 1963, Gallup is polling who to run against Kennedy in 64. Billy Graham is at the top of the list in almost every poll. And Johnson had to be aware of this by the time Kennedy is shot and begins to wrap his arms a little tighter around Billy Graham, inviting him to the ranch a little bit more. A group of Texas oilmen actually pushed Graham to run for president in 64. And Graham thought about it for a night or two until he called his wife, Ruth, and floated it with her quietly, and she said, I don't think the country's ready to elect a divorced president, Billy. He got the message. All husbands can read that one clearly. There is also some evidence in the Johnson Library that Goldwater approached Graham quietly in the summer of 64 to be his running mate. And you can imagine that Johnson, you sometimes listen to the tapes of Johnson they play on NPR on Saturdays. If you have no life like I do, then you spend your Saturdays in your car listening to NPR. Johnson was all over him on the tapes at this point, saying, why don't you come down? Come spend the weekend with us. We couldn't obviously talk to Johnson or Lady Bird, but we did talk to his 2 daughters, and talking to Lucy and Linda Bain Johnson is a great experience because they're just like their father. You get them on the phone, and like the NPR tapes, you really can't get off. Because let me tell you another story. Let me tell you another story. Let me tell you another story. And it was Linda who told us that the temperature in her house just dropped. Like a piece fell on the residents when Graham came to visit them. Lucy, who went from being she went to the Christian church, so I don't know what that makes her, but she became a Catholic during the time her father was in office. This really upset LBJ, and he turned to Graham again for advice, and Graham said, it's great, this is great, she's still in the family, let her have her journey, and he really made it possible for her to to stay close. Very interesting. You know, Graham never built the Church of Billy. He didn't. He just preached. And so if he ever really had a congregation, it was the First Families, because he didn't really have one otherwise. And so what we discovered that we didn't expect was that his relations with these families was far more intense and personal, and more about that in a minute. Closest, no question, to Johnson. And right on through to the end, the 2 days before Lady Bird died in June, Lucy and Linda were back on the phone with Graham. Graham got on the phone with Lady Bird, and they had prayer a day before she died, which, again, just an example. This is 40 years after she left the White House, 40-some years. So, not quite 40, I'm sorry. Again, an interesting relationship, unprecedented, closest to Johnson. No question, politically, he was closest to Nixon. This is a relationship that nearly ruined his ministry. He met Richard Nixon in the early 50s. They played golf on their first meeting. That must just do something to men. They played golf together on their first meeting. And Graham literally in letters professes his love for Nixon by 56. I mean, using that word, which is as tricky for men to use now as it probably was in 56, if not trickier. So a very close relationship. I think they were each other's eyes and ears in worlds that the other had never imagined they would be part of. Graham all but endorses Nixon in 60 in Life magazine, and then has to pull it at the last minute because he's racked by misgivings. By the time Nixon becomes president, Graham is preaching on Sundays in the East Room, you know, and I'm sure that Graham thought it was great because finally we're having religious services in the White House, and I'm sure the Nixon people thought it was great because, oh good, more people we can pay off and more time to twist arms, and they had nothing to do with spirituality or faith at all. It was another opportunity to essentially pay off friends and make stuff happen. And of course, there were horrible moments in the Nixon years where Graham was in meetings that he had no business being in, including ones in which the conversations turned pretty vile. And of course, it would embarrass Graham when they were finally released in 2004. Those are his comments about Jews. That was a relationship that became poisonous and nearly ruined Graham's otherwise extraordinary ministry. We asked Graham about that a lot, and about Nixon and how he so misjudged him, and Graham told us, in effect, you know, I was never really tempted by the other things that tempt people. I wasn't tempted by money, and I never felt the temptation of women. But I was tempted by power. I was tempted by politics. I was tempted by anyone who's ever been in the Oval Office knows that it's a place that makes your head swim, and it goes right to your head. And here's a man who was there through more presidents than, as we said, anyone in history. And for the most part, he kept his balance pretty well, but sometimes even he faltered. So closest to Nixon, he would also preach at his funeral, and his wife's funeral, and his mother's funeral. Closest personally to George Herbert Walker Bush. There's no question. This is someone Graham had met in the mid-'60s, but he met his mother, Dorothy Walker Bush, in the mid-'50s when she asked him to preach at her Bible study group in Hobe Sound, Florida in 1955. And when you think about that, and then remember that he would be ministering to a 40-year-old man named George W. Bush in 1985, some 30 years later, you begin to realize what kind of innings Graham had with the First Families. Extraordinary. 30-year family pastor. President Bush gave Graham an award last year at his library in College Station, Texas. And former President Bush is more emotional now than he was when he was president, but he couldn't get through the speech. And I think it's because Graham was, though a contemporary, though someone he'd known and helped him through a variety of challenges, someone who administered to his mom and his son. And there are lots of complicated stories about both of those things, but in the end, there's an element to presidential leadership and presidential reporting and White House coverage that isn't about policy and isn't about issues, and it's not about who's up and who's down. It's just about the human factor of being a person. And one of the things I learned in doing this book is that though we think about presidents as being superhuman and extraordinary, and they're really just people, and they have the same questions and doubts the rest of us have. Two other stories to tell before we maybe take some questions. One of the things I did not expect to find when I started this project was I thought I would do one chapter on the Clintons, on Bill Clinton. I ended up doing two. One is about him, and one is about her. The Clinton story, the Bill Clinton story, is extraordinary. And I don't think I'm taking too much license when I say I think it had to be something for a boy of Hope, out of Hope, Arkansas, to be taken to War Memorial Stadium at the age of 13 in 1959 and to see Billy Graham preach for the first time. I don't know what it was like, but I know the first time I got to go to a big arena about that age, and I don't think, it's just something you never forget. And to see Graham, who was preaching to, at that point, for 2 nights, an integrated audience, when there had been threats about him preaching to an integrated audience that week, something Clinton recalled vividly at the time and wrote about, and would later send money secretly to Billy Graham as a consequence, even though his mom and stepfather did not approve of it, suggests it had a huge impact on him. And he said later that it was the first time he saw, when he went to hear Billy Graham at 13, the first time he saw how he could make, and you can see him saying this, how faith and work could go together. It's not the same as faith and politics, but it's pretty close, especially if you're Clinton. So that had a huge impact. It had a big enough impact on Clinton that 12 years later, while he's, as my father would say, dancing in attendance of the young Hillary Rodham in Berkeley, California, in law school, one night when they could be doing just about anything in San Francisco that they wanted to, he invites his then girlfriend to go hear a Graham crusade in Oakland. It's not my idea of a hot date, but when I asked him about it, he said, I wanted her to hear Billy. She had never heard him. And he'd forgotten it, but she told us that story. It took us a while to figure out what city it had been in that because she couldn't remember exactly what city she'd seen him in with her then non-husband, Bill. Okay. Then, of course, 10 years pass, and Clinton is involved in an effort to bring Billy Graham back to, I got my Billies confused here. I'll just say Clinton is involved in an effort to bring Graham back to Little Rock for a real crusade. By 1989, there are only 2 states where Graham has not done a week-long crusade, and one of them is Arkansas. And Clinton gets on the program to get him back here. It takes a committee to do this, and it takes a lot of planning, and maybe some people here were involved. But he comes, and 2 things of significance happen in this crusade. Clinton wanted Graham to come to Arkansas to talk about mostly drugs and what we can do to stop the war on drugs. And he was interested in it because of its problems and education and how they were related. The first thing that happens is, between one of the crusade days, Clinton asked Graham, and you all know the story, to go out and visit W.O. Vaught, who is then Clinton's preacher at the Baptist Church and is dying. And the 2 men go out there in Clinton's car. He drives Billy Graham out to Vaught's house, and they get out there, and they're just going to talk with him. But it turns out that Vaught has prepared a lesson for Graham and Clinton on essentially the Second Coming and another scripture which I can't pull from memory. And so there they are in Vaught's bedroom in 1989 in an afternoon when Clinton has driven Billy Graham out to the house, listening to Vaught essentially preach in private to the 2 of them. And when that's over, after 30 minutes, Vaught asks for prayers, and Clinton starts, and then Graham goes, and Vaught finishes each of them. And there are probably 200 events, private events, between Graham and the president in this book, but this few can hold a candle to the emotional power of this moment, because, of course, and Clinton talked to us about this, because here's his one friend praying for another. And you can just imagine what that must have been like. And Vaught doesn't live very long after that. And even now, Clinton, I think, like Bush, can barely talk about that moment. The second event that happens is that Hillary Clinton finally meets Billy Graham. It happens in the Capitol Hotel lobby. She walks up to him at a reception. Capitol Hotel, right? Right. And she says, would you like to have lunch? And Billy Graham says, no, I'm sorry, I don't have lunch with women alone. Because he never did. He was that careful, even with the First Lady of Arkansas. So she says, okay, I'll get a group. So a group is arranged, and 10 minutes later, they're all having lunch in the bay window at the Capitol Hotel. And Graham is immediately and completely impressed. And if he was supposed to keep his mouth shut about that, he doesn't do a very good job for the next 15 years. He's quite outspoken about his feelings for her. He was then, and he is still now. And it's Hillary Clinton who opens the crusade with prayers on the first night, not her husband. It's interesting. So the Clinton chapter is fascinating, I think, because once Clinton becomes president, pretty much every evangelical leader in the Christian right is criticizing him from before the inauguration, but not Graham. He's going to work for him. Graham is very supportive in the early days. He agrees to pray at the inauguration, even though he is widely criticized in the evangelical community for doing it. And in addition to that, within a few months, he's actually taking on some foreign missions for Clinton. Clinton's having trouble getting through to the North Korean leader. Graham's going to North Korea. Clinton asks Graham to take a message, and he brings one back, and so forth. And it goes on like this. By 1995, the Republicans are so upset that Billy Graham is friends with Bill Clinton that they give him the Congressional Medal of Honor. And they stipulate for the first time in a decade that the award will be presented only by the Speaker of the House, not by, as is traditional, the President of the United States. Boy, this is hard to read through. Guess we can figure out what that's about. And Graham is such a clever, sees through this instantly, that he gets the award at 10 o'clock in the morning and immediately gets in a car and goes down to the White House. And spends the rest of the day with Clinton. He made it very clear that he wasn't going to be captured by one party or the other. The reason there's a second Clinton chapter, of course, is that in our conversations with Graham, he told us that he spent a lot of time in the second term talking to Hillary, which surprised us a little bit. Not a great deal. And then we asked the senator if we could come talk to her about it in January of this year. She said yes. And her story is almost as remarkable, in some ways more remarkable. Starts in Little Rock, but then by the time 1998 comes around and impeachment occurs, she tells us that she was the one who reached out for guidance from him. We know about President Clinton's spiritual pastoring at that point, but we didn't know much about hers. And she tells us for the first time in the book that she reached out to him, and at a time she said, when a lot of people were telling me to, effectively, split, he said, no, you have to do the harder thing. You have to forgive him. And he said this in public before almost anyone said it, and what we learned is that he'd said it in private as well. And as Mrs. Clinton told us, he was just personally really there for me. And we had a long interview with her, but on that particular line, she was quite emphatic. He was just personally really there for me. Which brings me to my final point, which is that it's amazing that a man who was able to forgive both Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, who was able to minister to both Hillary Clinton and George W. Bush, is still among us. Still lives at 88 on the top of a mountain in North Carolina, still follows the news closely. He told me that while Ruth was alive that he watched CNN and she watched Fox, and that made for some really interesting dinner table conversations. And he's constantly witnessing. I'm not a terribly spiritual person myself, but he's constantly witnessing. When we finally decided to put the excerpt of this book on the cover of Time a month ago, we called him up, we emailed his guy one last time and said, is there anything he'd like to talk about before we close this? Particularly about Ruth, because Ruth has been gone now for a month or two at the time. And he wrote us back a long series of thoughts about how he's coping, and how much of a struggle it is, and how much he misses her, and how much sometimes he just is overwhelmed, but he doesn't want to wallow in it, and he doesn't want to be one of those folks who just everything comes to a complete stop when he loses his partner of some 54 years. And it takes a lot of courage to say that stuff, and I think it's, I didn't have a lot of strong feelings about Mr. Graham before I started, but now that I've been through this process, my feelings are considerably stronger. And I learned a lot about presidents and what they need, and he said to us, they all need forgiveness. We all have the capacity for sin, but they have a grand capacity for sin, and so we have to be, extra careful with them. And I, having been a political reporter for 25 years or something, and spent most of my time thinking about the other aspect of my job, policy mostly, and politics, and who's up and who's out, and who's in and who's down. There is this other human factor that I think we all overlook, which is that they all have families, and they all have spouses, and they all have challenges, and they all have questions, and we don't give them much room to think about that stuff. But they don't have anyone they can really turn to talk about it because it's pretty sensitive and you don't want it talked about, and none of us really are comfortable, doing a lot of that. And they're in a particularly difficult spot when it comes to that. So it's all the more remarkable that one man was able to do it for so many. Not all, but most. So I think that I feel very lucky to have been able to tell the story, lucky that we were able to talk to him about it before he was no longer around to talk about it, and very blessed that the presidents, and we talked to Ford and Carter and Bush and Clinton, and we were able to get questions answered by the current president, as well as Nancy Reagan and the Johnson daughters and some of the other kids as well. It's just an amazing story about how our faith and our politics have always been connected and will always be. So I think I'll stop there, and if anyone has any questions, you can ask me.
We have time.
I promised Skip at some point I would talk about the current campaign, so you don't have to stick to this subject at all.
We have 2 mics in the audience. Just raise your hand and wait for the mic, and we'll call on you. Any questions?
There's one.
Joy?
Quick question. Did he ever actually belong to a church, one denomination? And did he belong to a political party?
Both really good questions. Graham is a Baptist and has always been and comes from a Baptist family. His wife was a Presbyterian, and he always thought that was an important and interesting difference in their lives. As political parties go, he has always been clear to be that he is a registered Democrat, like many people of his generation from the South. But it's been written about many times that someone said he registers Democrat, but he prays Republican. And it is true that he was, I think, closer to the Republican presidents than to the Democratic ones, except that people like Johnson and Clinton did have deep relationships with him. 2 stories to tell that are really interesting. In the early Eisenhower years, Graham is around a lot, and he's trying to get in to see Eisenhower. And at one point, he can't get through, and Eisenhower's doorkeeper says, that preacher wants to see you tomorrow. And Eisenhower said, "What preacher?" And his aide explained that it was Graham. And Eisenhower lost it and said, "I want to see him every time he comes. Every time." Which would be just another story, except that I have an almost identical one from the Clinton White House, wherein I think it was Mike McCurry who told us that at one point, when Graham was about to give the second inaugural address for the second Clinton inaugural, some White House aide, and I didn't really, since they've all become friends, I didn't really make a great effort to find out who this was, said, here, and then we have the Billy Graham, moment, and Clinton again said, "I don't want you, you could just see him, I don't want you ever to say anything bad about him while I am around. I will not tolerate it." So again, over 40 years, almost an identical presidential reaction from people of 2 really different parties' backgrounds. Eisenhower, just so you know, was raised in a household of his mother was a Jehovah's Witness, and that's one of the reasons he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be when he became president. Does that help? Yeah. There are some students here, I know.
Skip.
I want to ask mine.
Okay.
What about 2008? And your role as a former White House correspondent, you obviously follow the political thing. You've got an inside look at this. Give us your really candid thoughts. And I know what they are, so if you don't, I'm going to tell them anyway.
Okay. This is a setup question. Being told by Skip Rutherford that you're inside and he's not is... It's nice to be in Little Rock. Well, I think the current state of the race is about, there is a presumption that somehow people who cover this in politics understand it better than anyone else, and the fact is it's not true. Mostly it's what you see is pretty much the way it is. The Democratic race, it looks like Mrs. Clinton's to lose. Barack Obama has had 2 quarters here to catch up, and he's actually fallen behind. And And I don't think, I haven't seen that his campaign has the kind of tight working machinery that it will need to catch up. I could be surprised. I don't think John Edwards is going to last a lot longer after Iowa, but I could be wrong. So I think the race is pretty much just what the polls say it's going to be. It's hers to lose. And all the reasons are that she's been around the track before. That helps a huge deal. She has an astonishingly disciplined machine, and one or two of her close advisors knows a lot about the job. On the Republican side, my metaphor there is more like they're just chewing through one right after another, and they're not going to end up with anybody they like very much. The Republican Party has so many problems at this point that it almost doesn't, I sometimes think it almost doesn't matter who they nominate, except that that's not true. They are behind in money, they are behind in interest, they are behind in a level of activity, they are behind in the amount of satisfaction that their core voters have with their choices. So in every measure that we have, they're hurting. Privately, they all are quite, the ones I talk to who I think are smart are in some despair. And they seem to be obsessed with issues that the country doesn't care very much about in the main. So that's not a good combination at the moment. The field is much more up in the air, as you guys know, and I think it looks to me like it's chiefly Rudy Giuliani versus Mitt Romney, both men who are not typical Republican frontrunners. There is a lot of hope by some people being put into the Fred Thompson campaign. I'm not yet seeing much to base that on, but that could change. And I think Huckabee would be a formidable player if he looked like Mitt and had some money. But he doesn't. And that's the way that race stands up to me. I just don't see it yet happening. It could change, though, because it almost always changes, and there are always surprises, and I've rarely ever been right. but that's the way it looks to me. I think the other thing to keep in mind is when we get a year from now, if you had me back. Did you catch that? If you had me back, a year from now, you might be raising your hands and saying, you didn't mention anything about a third-party race. So to prevent that from happening when I come back, I'm going to say today that we always have a third-party candidacy in open elections. We had one in 80, in 88, we had one in 92, and it wasn't open. We had one in 2000, and while they never win, they always make a difference. And I don't know where it's going to come from. It looks like it would come from the right side of the balance sheet, but who knows? The left on the Democratic side is extremely active, as we saw from the noodle-headed Petraeus ad. It can make all kinds of silly mistakes because they're all young and they don't answer anybody and they're not very, thoughtful. So they could make a mistake and that we could have a third-party candidacy on the left too. But I think if when we all regather here next year, we might be talking about that factor, and we don't think of it now. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. Was I honest enough?
Hi, and thank you for coming. My name is Sarah Himmelfarb, and I'm a student here at the Clinton School. I was wondering, do you know of any other religious leaders that will be following in Billy Graham's footsteps? And if not, what effect will that have on future presidencies?
It's a great question. I get asked that a lot. There will never be another Billy Graham. This is a man who lifted evangelism out of fundamentalism, saved it from its anti-intellectual roots. And that will be the most important thing he did, not the presidents. This is, as he told us, a small part of my ministry. But there will never be someone who will know 11 presidents like this, I don't think. And I think one of the reasons he talked to us for this book, I think, was to lay down some lessons for people who might think they presume to follow, who might want to try to go down this road that he went down. And he says all through the book that I got too close, I shouldn't have been involved, it hurt me, and yet I kept doing it. It was just a real temptation for him, and I think he felt that it was a lesson hard learned, and that's one of the reasons he talked to us. But I don't think there's another one. Rick Warren is a very interesting person. He's obviously the Saddleback Church in California. He's written The Purpose-Driven Life. He came to our offices at Time Tuesday, I think. He's interesting, really interesting, and really appealing in a lot of ways. He's doing stuff in Africa and around the world that is really different than Graham would have done, but it's a different time. He's not that interested in traditional politics. He's interested in really unconventional ones, and that makes him surprising. But I don't think there'll ever be another Billy Graham who came along when the Cold War and television and a revival was happening in America. And he was a man that really came with an astonishing confluence of events. So not yet.
If, as you say, Senator Clinton is elected, how effective a president do you think she'll be, and how would you think that she would differ in that role from her husband?
Well, even in deference to Skip, I don't think I said she would be elected. I just said she was her race to lose. And I say that in front of this sign. That's courage. I was asked this question the other day, and I'm really stumped about this. I think there's some things we know that we can say about what a presidency would be like, but I don't think I can predict really well. She's obviously an extremely disciplined performer, and that's a great asset. She obviously has wrapped her head completely around a bunch of the issues, and particularly on Iraq and healthcare. And those are probably the top two that the nation is thinking about at home and abroad. She's taken a lot of criticism for not renouncing her vote, as you know, on Iraq. And I heard her say to some allies, this was a few months ago, she said it in private, and I told about it later. And the great thing about speaking at the Clinton school is if what you say is wrong, you'll hear about it. So here goes. That she had to think about not just getting through the week or through the month, but she had to think about getting what it would be like if she's nominated and what it would be like if she's president. So she doesn't want to make any statements or take any actions that would tie her hands if that takes place. Now, she said that in private a few months ago, but I heard her say it, I think, on the debate last night. That suggests to me that she's thinking about this in the right terms. Her office was always more organized, focused, disciplined than her husband's in the White House. That's not saying a lot. But it also was more secretive and harder to understand and penetrate and sometimes a little mysterious. So you've got to take the good with the bad. There is a huge number of people in Washington who are just waiting. There's a huge government in waiting, ready to go. But I think she could surprise us in ways we can't imagine. It always happens that way. We think we know what's going to happen, and then it turns out very differently. Which is a long way of saying I don't really know, but it's a question I'm getting more and more, and obviously we're going to have to think and do a story on this soon, because it's a good question, and I don't know the answer, what a Clinton presidency would be like. It's a great question. Now you've just paid for the trip. Thank you.
Bob, do you have one over here? Is there one? All right.
About the only person we hadn't mentioned was Chelsea. Did you meet her, and what was your impressions of her?
I've never met her. I thought what the Clintons did to keep her away from people like me was smart. It's a tactic I see the Bushes adopted. And give the press a little credit. I mean, there are not many places we can turn to where you can give them credit, but we actually did do the right thing there. So maybe the last time we did the right thing.
Right here.
I'm familiar with some Republicans locally, and it seems like in the previous election when McCain was running that the Republicans actually tried to undermine him by suggesting that he was mentally not maybe ready to deal with the presidency, et cetera.
Right.
And could you comment on that? And you didn't mention him a while ago.
Right. It's a good question. What happened to McCain? And well, you're right about what happened in 2000. They did get together in South Carolina and do everything they could to undermine his reputation, and it worked. And it showed you what hardball politics can be like. McCain started out this race as the logical frontrunner, but then adopted a strategy that made him seem strangely like it was his turn. And what had always made McCain appealing to people was that he seemed outside of politics and a maverick and above all that silly stuff. And he went and adopted a campaign style that was just like, a kind of classic, it's my turn, Republican. And he hired most of the Bush operation to run it, which is the kind of campaign they had run, and it went right into the ground. And it is popular now among people who are political reporters to say he will rise again, but I'm not one of them. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think you get a second shot. Democrats are really good at faltering, living, like Clinton did, and then coming back, the comeback kid, and living off the land. It's part of the Democratic, bootstrap story. It's almost like Democrats make their nominees, fall on the ground and make them get back up again. That's part of the process, but not Republicans. They want it to be a more stately walk to the nomination. So I don't think he comes back, and I think the reason is that he lost touch with what made him popular before. And it's too bad. I think he could have been good. Yes, yes, right.
We have time for one more question in the back. Okay.
I wanted to ask one last question about Billy Graham. From what I read in the media, it seemed several years ago that he wanted to bypass his daughter Anne and leave his ministry to Franklin, who seemed not well prepared for that. Do you think Billy Graham himself has issues with gender equality? What is your opinion of why he would do that?
Wow. Now, I knew that Skip was trying to get me in trouble, having me come down and talk about, the 2008 race, but that's easy compared to this question. One of the reasons I thought it was best to stick to the Billy Graham and the presidents is that I knew that if I ventured out of that into issues of, theology or spirituality, I would make a complete fool of myself. And so I have no idea. It is true that his son took over, BGEA Franklin. Anne Lotz Graham, if you've seen her on television, is a tremendous preacher, I think. Really good. I can't take my. They're all so handsome. It's hard to take your eyes off any of them. But I think she's really good. But the family, and she calls herself a Bible teacher. So you could draw your own conclusions about what that means. That may be how she prefers to refer to herself. But I'm not steeped enough in the byways and pathways of Southern Baptists to make a comment about that. So. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it from Michael Duffy.
Guy's really good, knows his stuff. He's now going over to the book signing table, so those who have your books can have them signed, and those who would like to purchase can buy one and get him to sign it.